Post-imperial origins of the Commonwealth as an international institution provide a fruitful basis of comparison between the political institutions of its member countries. The extent to which they have conformed to, diverged from, or consciously rejected the Westminster model in its various forms. Britain has provided at least a partial template to the broad outlines of the constitutional practice, both in the old Commonwealth countries and in the newly independent states that emerged from the process of decolonisation post-1945. The British governments presided over attempts, many of them unsuccessful, to incorporate these practices in written constitutions. The 2004 Latimer House Principles articulated a consensus within the Commonwealth on achieving a balance between the major branches of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Britain differs from all these countries in that it has no written constitution itself, and it has been a salutary, if to many of us unwelcome, reminder of what this would have meant had the Scottish referendum gone the other way. At the very least, it would have led to a fundamental change in Britain's constitutional status, which would have meant, and may still mean, that the so-called Mother of Parliaments is learning key lessons from the experience of younger countries, both in the Commonwealth and outside it. But that is another topic, and not for this session. The English language provides a powerful cultural, especially a literary, link, exemplified in the Man Booker Prize, which was awarded recently, and many aspects of the work of the British Council, which other speakers have spoken about. The traditional arts and cultures of the Commonwealth countries in Africa and Asia and the Caribbean, have few such common reference points, and owe little either to each other or to the former imperial power. But they do have a strong political element, both in forging and defining national identity and in asserting their presence to the international community outside their borders. The relatively recent idea of soft power describes a phenomenon that precedes existing political boundaries by hundreds, if not thousands of years. Soft power is the spread and influence of ideas and images and the institutions that have been built on them. In a war, even where a conflict of ideology is one of its causes, they may be dismissed as irrelevant, as when Stalin is said to have asked contemptuously, "How many divisions has the Pope?" In some cases, they may be highly visible but limited in their effect. Chinese takeaways have been with us in Britain for decades and have formed our tastes. But as a measure of power, they do not equal the availability and popularity now of Chinese manufactured goods. Chicken tikka masala may have displaced fish and chips as Britain's favourite dish, but is surely less significant as a measure of Indian international influence than the strong growth of India's economy in a globalizing world. Whatever may underlie these big successes in changing culinary tastes, they have hardly depended on anything other than commercial institutions to promote them. They are regulated, if at all, by the same standards as any food supply, primarily hygiene and health. They have little ideological content or substance. Media institutions present a more mixed picture. We're still consumers, but of a different kind. Powerful national and international media corporations have a big influence on the way we think. As both national and global citizens, we need to understand them and, at least to some extent, to regulate them. The ultra-libertarian view that anything goes carries with it the danger of drowning out voices which are not backed by the market and commercial interests. But the control that governments want to exercise is often at the expense of freedom of speech and expression. It requires institutions to establish and uphold a balance. The scope and operation of those essentially cultural institutions involves decisions which are deeply political. In the countries of South Asia and in other Commonwealth countries, there are illuminating comparisons to be made of the way in which media and cultural institutions have evolved and the policies that South Asian governments have adopted towards them. In India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, though not Nepal, started from a similar baseline of colonial legislation and regulatory practice. In some cases, UK legislation relating to aspects of freedom of expression was adopted temporarily as a default base for determining the law in newly independent countries. Following independence, the pressures in favour of legislative and cultural autonomy intensified and the legacy became less important. More than those pressures, the rapid changes in communications technology have presented a global set of challenges to the inherited colonial pattern of regulation, which have called for national solutions in South Asia as in every part of the world. The record in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka in shaping and changing key elements of its media environment forms a key part of the development of their cultural policy and soft power in each of those countries. Perhaps the most seminal decision for India's move away from a broadcasting monopoly to a recognition of a plural system was the judgment of the Indian Supreme Court in 1995 that the airwaves are public property, not an asset for the exclusive disposal of the government, as had previously been the case, the practice. The judgment has been rightly seen as an assertion of the fundamental freedom of the airwaves. As such, it was a reinforcement of the wider freedom of expression which the Indian constitution already guaranteed, but which had not affected the government's monopoly status as a broadcaster. Broadcasters and cultural entrepreneurs had already grasped and were profitably developing the satellite channels which were beamed from outside Indian territory and jurisdiction. Local cable networks picked up these transmissions and passed them on a mass scale for the first time. These were initially unregulated, but quickly came under scrutiny and a measure of control. The 1995 Indian Supreme Court judgment had an impact outside India as well, in stating a principle which other South Asian governments hesitated to deny outright, even if they did not follow the Indian judiciary in stating it. It would be a mistake to see this judgment as a neoliberal charter giving open-ended access to the market providers in the field of broadcasting and telecommunications. In citing the path-breaking nature of the Supreme Court judgment, it is not so often recognized that the court qualified its ruling by saying that while the airwaves are public property, it is the obligation of the state to ensure that they are used for public good. However, independent broadcasters and civil society activists outside government in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Pakistan were energized by the Indian example and its potential implications for their own regulatory regimes. Part of the influence of the judgment is the continuance in this forward-looking context of the idea of a public good or public interest. The concept of a public service broadcaster belongs very much to a European, especially a British tradition. Through Britain, it became widely spread became a widely spread Commonwealth principle. In South Asia, the state broadcasters had appropriated the concept to describe their own role. South Asian governments have typically claimed that as elected bodies, they are the legitimate interpreters and guardians of the public interest and guardians of a public service ethos. But the state broadcasters have been required to act as the mouthpiece of government policy, controlled by ministries of information. This had the effect of devaluing the idea of public service or public interest broadcasting. New definitions of the public interest, as, for example, whatever the public is interested in or will watch and pay for, have championed commercial success as the only valid measure of quality or value. The argument has a strong political and ideological element. In a narrow sense, it is used to criticize the perceived or alleged shortcomings of a public service broadcaster. In a more positive sense, it may be used to affirm that program quality and public interest is often achieved by commercially funded channels as well as by publicly funded or license fee funded program services. In Britain, apart from the BBC, the independent terrestrial channels are classified and have obligations as public service broadcasters. Many state broadcasters in the Commonwealth rely substantially on commercial income as well as public funding. Within the Commonwealth, debates between professional broadcasters have often focused on reconciling the supposed contradictions between commercial funding and the public interest, which the state broadcasters are pledged to uphold. The freedom of the airwaves debate and the 1995 Indian Supreme Court judgment had been long preceded within South Asia by another long-standing discussion over the appropriate institutional status of a national or state broadcaster. Before the cable and satellite channels broke the state monopolies in South Asia, there had been an aspiration, widely shared among broadcasting professionals, for the state broadcasters to have functional autonomy. The BBC was often taken as a successful model of an institution which was publicly funded but not government controlled. Outside government, politicians and political parties advocated autonomy for the state broadcaster, but shied away from implementing the idea in office. In India, the Janata, that's a non-Congress government, took the first steps in setting up the state broadcaster, Prasar Bharati, as an autonomous body, shortly before losing office in 1990, and it was not until 1997 that the move was completed. However, the degree of independence of the state broadcaster remained uncertain and has been contested ever since. The advent of multiple satellite TV channels and the commercially successful establishment and development of independent TV news channels, which had been thought in the early stages of transnational satellite TV not to be viable, changed the balance of the argument. It was now the government which argued that in the din of the independent news channels, it needed a voice of its own. The satellite news channels provide alternative and competitive access to sources of news. This is not to say that they have secured a reputation for reliability or objectivity or the qualities that are supposed to set the standard for an autonomous public service news organization. Controversies over the media in India have arisen from paid news and infotainment, so-called news dressed up as entertainment, which simplifies and distorts the real issues. Undercover investigative journalism is not always obviously in the public interest. Phone hacking and sting operations on public figures are controversial. They raise wide-ranging ethical questions about the practice of journalism. But the debate has moved on, and autonomy for the state broadcasters in South Asia is no longer at the center of the argument. Broadcasters of all types face a much more potent challenge from the mass of news and information available, often unchecked and unverified on the internet. The social media make anyone a potential participant in policy analysis, or, as so often the case, in personal abuse. A younger generation, the digital natives, as they're sometimes called, can get all the information they need and more online. There are huge benefits in this as well as dangers, but the new digital media have placed the old media, including both public and commercial broadcasters, and the privately owned print and electronic media, on the same side of the fence. They are re-examining and negotiating their strategies of survival. This has become a central element of contemporary cultural diplomacy. This is quite a big field. It involves a test of strength between national media institutions, international institutions of governance, global corporations, national governments, legislators, and judiciaries. In South Asia, there are continuing significant developments, with many issues still unresolved. Laws to establish and protect a right to information, previously covered, if at all, by a general constitutional right to freedom of expression, have within the past 10 years been passed or proposed in most of the countries of South Asia. India passed a right to information law in 2005, Bangladesh in 2009, Pakistan in 2013. Nepal adopted a right to information law in 2007, updating a provision first included in the now obsolete monarchical constitution of 1990. Sri Lanka's articulate and civil society has been in the forefront of making out the case for a right to information law. In 2010, the Sri Lankan government said it was on the verge of publishing its own proposals. Since then, nothing has emerged, and the gap remains, which I must say is a sad failure of resolution and leadership in a country which is currently chair of the Commonwealth. In all the countries of South Asia, the RTI laws, when passed, have proved problematic in their implementation. In India, both the government and the judiciary have actively contested aspects of the right to information. Use of the law has been less than expected, and enforcement has been relatively weak. But in the 9 years of its operation, the direct challenges to its remit by government and the judiciary in India have met with a vigorous response. In 2012, a Supreme Court ruling was revised on the grounds that it went against the spirit of the Right to Information Act. Most recently, a Madras High Court judgment was also revised after a challenge by activists. Pakistan still has to adopt a full RTI law at the federal level, but the RTI law was enacted in 2013 at a provincial level in the northern province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, formerly the Northwest Frontier Province. Efforts are being made to boost civil society watchdog groups, as in India, to monitor freedom of information issues. In Nepal, among the many open issues of governance, a substantive RTI law still has to be enacted. In recent years, the regulation of the media in South Asia has been as much a contested issue there as in Britain. There's been controversy over what kind of regulation is needed or acceptable and what institutions should be set up for this purpose. As with the state broadcasters, independence or autonomy of the regulatory body for broadcasting communications has been contested. In India, the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of India, TRAI, initially made a bid for total autonomy, but was brought back under the control of the Ministry of Communications. In other South Asian countries, the government remained the ultimate authority. Both broadcasters and print media have argued for a high degree of self-regulation as their preferred framework, rather than control or censorship. Practices in the different countries of South Asia vary, but a consensus within the media industry has not always been possible to maintain. A cautious approach to self-regulation has been accompanied, in Sri Lanka, for instance, by a routine self-censorship. In India, the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority has been working on proposals for restricting cross-media ownership between the print and electronic media, and creating a buffer between corporate owners and the management of print and electronic news media organizations. These proposals have met with strong opposition from the industry. In Sri Lanka, private media organizations and independent-minded editors have been liable to be brought under control by being bought out by allies of the government. That happened to one paper where the editor had refused to resign, the government wanted to remove her, and then the president got a friend of his to buy the company, and he sacked her. In India, the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority has been working on proposals for restricting cross-media ownership. Other areas where free reporting in the print and electronic media has come under pressure from either the government or judiciary include contempt of court, parliamentary privilege, criminal defamation. Sri Lanka abolished the law of criminal defamation, which was a very heavy weight on the freedom of the press, in 2002. This rare success for the active civil society lobby for media freedoms was made possible by the special political circumstances of a short period of cohabitation between the then President Chandrika Kumaratunga of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party and the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe of what was normally the opposition, United National Party. When that temporary coalition broke, the law was not revived. So that remained a success for that brief period of cohabitation government. The judiciary and the parliaments in both India and Sri Lanka have been protective of their own privileges and have not hesitated to enforce them through judicial and parliamentary restrictions on free reporting. Other important institutional decisions affecting the dissemination of information in South Asian countries have been shown in policies towards community radio. Indian and South Asian attitudes have been much less supportive of a medium which in many African countries has been developed successfully as a cheap and effective platform for reaching rural communities especially. India confined community radio initially to educational outlets under the auspices of the Indira Gandhi Open University. The Indian government was fixated on licensing a local radio network solely for profit and made no special allowance for the public interest value of community radio. Sri Lanka has always been more adventurous than other South Asian countries in permitting commercial alternatives to the state radio and television services. But its community radio model, implemented at Kodmali in association with the massive hydro project, the Mahaweli Dam, was seen as an exciting pioneering venture. But even this was structured as part of the government-run Sri Lanka Broadcasting Service. It was not an independent community project. Community radio and local radio in general have always been seen as a potential security risk in South Asian countries. And this has hampered the inherent potential of the medium. While television news channels have mushroomed, local radio is banned from developing as a news medium. Both in India and Sri Lanka, the internet has given rise to new, independently mediated, or not mediated, sources of information and platforms for disseminating information. National security considerations and globally sanctioned initiatives to combat child pornography and other criminal activity give governments a common incentive to extend the means of control over the internet. Civil society watchdog organizations and independent bloggers and activists aim to track the extent to which crime prevention technologies may be used to limit legitimate freedom of expression. In Sri Lanka especially, the close involvement of China in major development and communications projects give rise to a suspicion that the practices of control and censorship that China uses in its own territory would be made available to the Sri Lankan government. Even after previously long-standing emergency provisions in Sri Lanka, arising out of the civil war, have been lifted, that government maintains tight control over the provision of information and public discussion. And to finish, I'd like to focus on the importance of the role of civil society in all these issues. Paradoxically, Sri Lanka's 30-year ordeal of insurgency and civil war has given rise to what are in many ways more radical and open approaches to protecting media freedoms. Key documents, such as the formation of the Free Media Movement in 1991, the report of a parliamentary committee, the RKW Gunasekara Committee in 1996, the setting of a bipartisan approach to issues of media reform, and the Colombo Declarations of 1998 and 2008, though ignored by governments and officialdom in Sri Lanka, have set the highest standards of civil society engagement and influence thinking, and they influence thinking on media freedoms and freedom of expression beyond the boundaries of Sri Lanka. This is perhaps the best measure of soft power and cultural diplomacy, and a compelling advertisement of the value of investing in this type of association. Thank you.